My name is Erin Fletcher. I am 38 years old. On the afternoon, my older sister Diane told my mother that she had never once been able to explain to her children what I did for a living. A woman I had never met walked around the corner of the Forensic Sciences building and stopped in the middle of the parking lot, 15 feet from where my family was standing, and pressed a manila folder against her chest with both hands as if she were afraid it would fly away from her. She was shaking so hard the papers inside the folder made a soft, continuous sound, like dry leaves. My sister went completely silent. My mother took one small step backward. The woman looked at me and said, in English so careful and precise it sounded like she'd been rehearsing it for weeks, "Are you the one who gave my son his name back?" I had my old coffee cup in my hand from that morning. I had my lab bag over my left shoulder, the one that always slides because the strap clip is broken, and I have never replaced it. My back was aching from the afternoon, the way it always does by 4 o'clock, the way it has done every day for the last 6 years. I set the cup down on the hood of the nearest car. I said, "Yes, ma'am, I believe that is me." She covered her mouth with one hand and closed her eyes, and she made a sound that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. My sister did not say a single word the entire drive to dinner. The thing about my family is that they are not cruel people. I want to say that first because the story does not work correctly if you assume that they are. Diane is a 4th grade teacher who has won the District Kindness Award twice. She coaches her daughter's soccer team on Saturday mornings and sends handwritten birthday cards to every student she has ever had, which is a number I cannot calculate but suspect is in the hundreds. My mother, Ruth, made a quilt for every neighbor who moved onto her street for the last 22 years and has never once been asked to stop. They are genuinely good people who love me in all the ways that good people love a family member they do not understand. And for a very long time, I told myself that was enough. I grew up in a mid-sized town in the upper Midwest in a house that smelled like fabric softener and the specific kind of soup my mother made every Sunday. I was a quiet child who liked the outside more than the inside. I collected things I found on the ground, rocks with odd striations, pieces of pottery from the creek behind our subdivision, once a deer jaw, still intact, which my mother allowed me to keep on the porch in a plastic bin but not inside the house. My father, who passed when I was 23, was a retired firefighter who took me to the Natural History Museum 4 times before I was 8 years old and never once told me the fossil room was too heavy for a kid. He would stand in front of the mounted skeletons in that long hall and say things like, "Remarkable, just remarkable. Look at how that fits together." He had no training in paleontology or biology or anything adjacent. He was a man who had spent a career around injury and death and had somehow come to find the evidence of life genuinely astonishing rather than merely grim. I think he understood, without being able to articulate it, that you can look directly at what remains of a thing and feel something other than horror. I think about him often when I am working. By the time I started my undergraduate degree in biological anthropology, Diane was already teaching and married to a man named Gary, who is perfectly fine and coaches youth basketball and talks about his car more than seems strictly necessary. She had already developed the habit that would follow us for the next 15 years, which was the habit of changing the subject. When I came home for Thanksgiving during my junior year and someone at the table asked what my concentration was, Diane said, "Bones," right before I could answer. Then she said, sort of like archaeology, and then she pivoted immediately to something about her school's fall festival, and the topic evaporated. I did not push back. I was 20 years old and I was used to the pivot by then. It had already happened at least 5 times since I declared my major, and I had learned to recognize the small tightening around Diane's eyes that preceded it, the way she would draw in a breath like she was about to jump over something. The thing about forensic anthropology that is difficult to explain to people who do not want to hear it is that it is not about death. I know that sounds like exactly the kind of thing a person working with human remains would say to make other people more comfortable, and I have used it that way sometimes. But it is also simply true. What forensic anthropology is about, at its most essential level, is identification. It is about taking what is left of a person and reading everything that person's life inscribed onto their skeleton, the age at which they grew, the kind of labor their body absorbed, the injuries they sustained and recovered from, and the ones they did not, the shape of their ancestry in the structure of their orbital ridges and the angle of their nasal spine. It is reading a person in the only language that survives everything else. That is what I do. I read people who cannot speak and I translate what they are still saying. I finished my doctorate at 31 with a dissertation on perimortem fracture patterns in unidentified remains from long-term missing persons cases. My advisor, a woman named Dr. Anita Poole, who had built the forensic unit at our university almost from nothing over 20 years, told me the day I defended that I had a precision in the lab that she did not see often. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, while eating a piece of the congratulatory cake one of the other graduate students had brought. She said, "You are patient with evidence that has nothing left to offer except itself. That is rarer than it sounds." I have kept that sentence in my head ever since, not because it was a compliment, but because it felt like the most accurate description of what the work requires that I had ever heard. Marcus came to the lab 2 years after I joined the forensics unit as a junior researcher. He had been a medic in the Army for 8 years and had come to forensic science through a path that involved a year of grief counseling and 2 years of graduate coursework that he described as the most disorienting experience of his life. He is 42 now, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with the particular quality of stillness that some people who have seen a great deal of urgency develop afterward. He calls me Doc. I have a doctorate. So does he. He started calling me Doc during our second week working together when I was hunched over a set of tibial fragments trying to determine whether a spiral fracture was perimortem or postmortem, and he brought me a sandwich without being asked and set it at the edge of the table and said, "Eat something, Doc. Bones don't go anywhere." I told him I was in the middle of something. He said, "The tibia knows." I ate the sandwich. Marcus is the only person in my daily life who does not require me to explain or apologize for what I do. He has never once pivoted away from describing our work to someone at a party. He describes it directly and completely and then waits with what I can only call forensic patience while the other person processes it. Sometimes they find it fascinating. Sometimes they look for the nearest exit. He does not adjust his description either way. I have always admired this about him more than I have ever told him, which he would probably say is characteristic of me. The years between my doctorate and the case that changed the shape of everything move the way years do when you are absorbed in work that matters and lonely in the parts of your life that exist outside it. I built a good reputation in the lab. I worked more cases than I can count without going back through my documentation, which I keep in 3-ring binders in a cabinet in my office because I have never trusted cloud storage for case files, a habit doctor. Poole finds both endearing and infuriating. I drove my old truck to work and to family gatherings and to the gas station where I bought the coffee that Marcus describes as a genuine professional mystery given what we can afford in the faculty lounge. I adjusted my office chair 15 times and it still was not right. I developed the lower back pain that comes from years of hunching over tables and kneeling in field excavations. A pain that arrives every afternoon around 4 o'clock and that I manage with ibuprofen and a heating pad from the dollar store that I keep in my bottom desk drawer and that Marcus has borrowed twice and always returns with an apology. And I went to family dinners. I went to Diane's house at Christmas and at Easter and at Thanksgiving and at Gary's birthday in September, which Gary celebrated by cooking a large amount of meat in the backyard while discussing his car. I went to my mother's house on her birthday and on the 4th of July when she still had the energy to do sparklers in the driveway. I sat at tables covered with food I did not make because I am not a good cook and have never been, and I listened to the conversations flow around me the way water goes around a rock. And I waited for the moment that always came, the moment when someone would ask what I had been working on lately, and I would watch Diane's shoulders rise slightly, and I would give the simplest possible version of an answer, and the conversation would move on. It was not dramatic. That is the thing I want to be clear about. because stories like this are often told as if there is some moment of open confrontation, some dinner where someone finally says the terrible thing out loud and then everything can be addressed. It was not like that. It was incremental. It was the accumulation of years of small adjustments, small pivots, small silences. It was the way Diane would say, Erin works in forensics, when someone asked, and then leave it at that, as if forensics was a self-contained and unremarkable thing like accounting or logistics. It was the way my mother, who I believe genuinely loves me and genuinely does not know what to do with what I am, would say things like, Erin is very dedicated to her career, in a tone that communicated admiration and mild bewilderment in equal parts. It was the family birthday dinner 3 years ago when Diane said, just casually, not cruelly, just as a passing remark in conversation, that she told her kids Aunt Erin worked in a science lab because she did not know how else to put it. Her youngest was 8, her middle one was 10, her oldest was 12. I do not think Diane said it to hurt me. I think she said it because it was true and because she had stopped noticing that it might land a particular way. I smiled and said something, and the conversation moved on. I drove home an hour later and sat in my truck in the driveway for 40 minutes before going inside. I did not call Marcus that night. I should say that. I thought about it. I went inside and heated up a bowl of something from the refrigerator and sat at my kitchen table in the way that I do when I am processing something I do not have language for yet, which involves eating mechanically and staring at the middle distance. I have a small house that I bought 6 years ago because the mortgage was lower than rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. It has 3 rooms that matter and 2 that I have never furnished properly and a backyard that I do not use but intend to. I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about the 12-year-old who had been told that Aunt Erin worked in a science lab, and I thought about all the things I had not said at the dinner table, the cases I had not described, the names I had given back that I had never mentioned to anyone in my family because there was never an opening and I had learned not to create one. There was a woman I identified in 2019, a case that had been open for 11 years, remains found during a utility excavation in a rural county 3 states away. She had a healed fracture of the left radius, old enough to predate her disappearance by at least 5 years, and a distinctive wear pattern on her lower molars that told me things about her diet and her habits and her life. It took me 4 months and 2 rounds of DNA comparison to confirm her identity. Her daughter, who was 12 when she disappeared and 23 when I made the identification, came to the university with her father to receive the official notification. I was not part of that meeting. I never am. I do the laboratory work and I write the report and I hand it to the case coordinator and I go back to the lab. I heard later from the coordinator that the daughter had asked who specifically had done the identification and had been told it was one of the forensic anthropologists on staff and had said, "Will you tell her?" I said, "Thank you." The coordinator had told me this in passing, almost as an afterthought, in the hallway outside the break room. I had said, "Of course," and gone back to my office. And I had sat at my desk for a while with my hand on the heating pad, and I had thought about the daughter and what it means to be told, after 11 years, that your mother has been found. I had not mentioned this to anyone in my family. I had not mentioned any of it, because there was no opening and I had learned not to create one. Marcus knew. Marcus always knew. Not because I told him all of it, but because he was in the lab with me through all of it, and some things do not need to be narrated when you are present for them. He knew about the back pain. He knew about the gas station coffee. He knew that I arrived at work 45 minutes before anyone else, and that I did not do it because I was obsessive or anxious, but because I liked the lab when it was quiet and nobody needed anything from me and I could just work. He knew that I did not respond to text messages promptly, a quality he described once as the most professionally inexplicable thing about me and then immediately described as extremely on brand. He knew that when a case was difficult, I went silent in a particular way, a going inward quiet that he had learned to give space to without interpreting it as an invitation to check in. He was, in the specific and irreplaceable way of people who share a kind of work that most others find difficult to look at directly, my person at work, not my only person, but the one who made the work feel less solitary. The case that changed things came in during the third week of January 2024, on a Tuesday morning, when the temperature outside was 14 degrees and the heating in the forensic sciences building was doing what it always does in deep winter, which is maintain a determined and partially successful battle against the cold that leaves the lab itself acceptably warm and the hallway outside genuinely unpleasant. The remains had been referred through an international coordination channel that our lab had worked with before, a partnership with a forensic identification program operating in Southeast Asia. They arrived packaged correctly, documented carefully, with a preliminary field assessment that noted adult male, estimated age 20 to 30 at time of death, blast-related trauma to the lower extremities and portions of the pelvis, recovery from a mountainous region during road expansion work. The paperwork listed the remains as having been discovered in late 2023. The case number was referred to in the documentation in the standard alphanumeric format our coordination office uses for international referrals. I took the case because I was next in the rotation and because the preliminary assessment indicated complexity that I had experience with. Blast-related trauma to skeletal remains presents specific interpretive challenges, not in terms of identifying trauma, that part is usually straightforward, but in terms of distinguishing perimortem trauma from postmortem fragmentation, which matters enormously for the reconstruction of what happened and when. I set up the workstation, documented the initial inventory, photographed everything in situ before disturbing any element of the arrangement, and began. 9 months is a long time to work a single case. It is not unusual in this field for complex identifications to take that long or longer. It is, however, a significant commitment of time and attention that is difficult to explain to someone who does not do this work. Because from the outside, a 9-month investigation of skeletal remains sounds like it must involve constant new developments and dramatic discoveries. It does not. It involves a great many hours of careful, methodical, repetitive analysis. It involves comparing measurements against population databases and reassessing the comparison when it is inconclusive. It involves writing detailed notes that no one may ever read and then writing them again more carefully. It involves consulting with colleagues, reaching out to counterparts in other labs, requesting additional documentation from the field team, waiting for DNA results that take longer than anyone would prefer, and then waiting again when the first set of results is insufficient to achieve a match and a second comparison must be initiated. It involves, in this particular case, a slow and methodical reconstruction of a life from the elements of a skeleton, the density of the cortical bone, the closure patterns of the cranial sutures, the healed fracture of the right clavicle that predated death by several years and told me something about this person's past, the wear on the dentition, the musculoskeletal markers on the femoral heads that indicated habitual physical labor of a particular kind. He had been strong. That was one of the first things I understood about him before I knew anything else. The attachment sites on his femora and humeri told a story of sustained, heavy, physical work begun in adolescence. He was not unusually tall, mid-range for the population data I was working from, but his skeleton was dense and sturdy in the way of someone who had used their body hard since they were young. The healed clavicular fracture was consistent with a fall from a significant height or a blow from a heavy object, healed cleanly with only minor callus formation, suggesting he had been young and healthy when it happened. He had lost a lower left molar at some point in his life, pre-mortem, the socket remodeled and smooth, and the adjacent teeth had shifted slightly toward the gap in the particular way that teeth do when a space is left and not replaced. The blast trauma to his lower extremities was severe and had been immediately lethal. He had not had time to suffer long. That is not always the case, and I note it always, even when there is no one else in the room to note it to. Marcus came in one evening in March, when I had been at the workstation for 3 hours past the time I usually go home, which he noted by standing in the doorway of the lab and asking what time I thought it was. I told him I knew what time it was. He came in and looked at the workstation and was quiet for a moment in the way he is when he is assessing something that he does not want to comment on prematurely. Then he said, "This one's getting under your skin." I said, "They all do." He said, "Some more than others." I said, "Yes." He went to the cabinet where we keep the emergency food supplies, which is a term we use for the collection of granola bars and crackers and a jar of peanut butter that neither of us brought in deliberately, but that appears to replenish itself through unclear mechanisms. And he brought back 2 granola bars and set one on the edge of my table. I said, "Thank you." He pulled a stool to a point about 3 feet from my workstation, which is the distance that means I am here, but I am not in your way, and he sat with his own granola bar and was quiet for a while. He said, "Eventually, what are you looking for?" I said I was looking for something specific enough to run against the regional missing persons data that the coordination office had pulled for the age range in the geographic area. He said, "What kind of specific?" I said I was not sure yet, but I thought the clavicular fracture and the molar extraction together might be unusual enough to be useful if there was any medical documentation in the missing persons files. He said, "How old were they when the clavicle healed?" I said probably early to mid-teens, based on the remodeling pattern. He said, "So whatever happened to the clavicle happened when they were a kid?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That's the kind of thing a parent remembers." I said, "Yes." He finished his granola bar and left me to the work, and I stayed until 9 o'clock that night and went home with my back hurting in the specific deep way that means I pushed it too far and would feel it in the morning. The DNA process took 2 separate rounds. The first generating results that were statistically suggestive but not conclusive. The second, run after the coordination office obtained a reference sample from a potential family match. Coming back in late October with a result that I had enough experience to read before the statistical summary finished processing, I sat with the results for 45 minutes before I wrote the report, not because I was uncertain, because I was not, and because when you are not uncertain, it means the remains on your table are a person with a name, and you want to sit with that for a moment before the paperwork begins. His name was Wheaton Minkwon. He was 23 years old when he died, which placed his death in the range of 2006 to 2009, most consistent with the latter years of that range based on the environmental taphonomy data from the field team. He had been reported missing in 2007 by his family after he traveled to a remote mountainous region to take a construction job and did not return. His mother had filed the missing persons report. She had filed follow-up inquiries in 2009, 2012, 2016, and 2021. Each inquiry had been received and logged. Each inquiry had returned the same answer: case open, no determination made. 17 years. She had asked 4 times in 17 years and received the same answer. I wrote the report over 3 days, drafting and revising with the particular care I give to reports in identification cases, where the language matters in a way that technical documentation does not always require, but this kind does. The report is a document that will be read by people who are not scientists, people who have been waiting for a long time, and it needs to be precise without being cold and clear without being clinical in the way that excludes the human reality of what it is describing. I have had colleagues tell me I spend too much time on the language of my reports. I have never agreed with them. The report was completed and submitted in early November, and I went back to the other cases on my desk, and I did not hear anything more about it directly for several weeks. The coordination office told me in late November that the family had been notified. They told me the mother had received the report. They did not tell me anything further. I did not ask. That is the boundary of my role in this process, and I have always respected that boundary, both because it is professionally appropriate and because I have learned over years of doing this work that what happens after the report leaves my desk belongs to the family. My part is the identification. Their part is whatever comes after. What I did not know in November, and would not know until the following March, was that Mrs. Nguyen Thi Lan, 64 years old, had received the report and had read it with the help of a Vietnamese American community organization that provided translation assistance for official documents. She had read every page of it, including the technical sections, including the bone analysis sections, including my descriptions of the healed clavicular fracture and the remodeled molar socket and the musculoskeletal markers that indicated habitual physical labor. She had read a document written by a forensic anthropologist she had never heard of in a country she had never visited, and somewhere in that document she had understood that her son had been studied and considered and described as a person, not cataloged as remains. That distinction mattered to her enormously, as it turned out. It mattered to her so much that she saved her money for 4 months and she got on a plane. I did not know any of this in November. I did not know it in December or January or February. In those months, I worked my other cases, drove my old truck to the gas station for coffee that Marcus continued to find professionally inexplicable, went to the family Christmas dinner at Diane's house where we ate a lot of food, and Gary talked about his car, and my mother asked me how work was going, and I said it was going well, and no one asked a follow-up question. I arrived 45 minutes early and sat in my truck in Diane's driveway, waiting for the time to seem reasonable, listening to the radio. I took ibuprofen at noon. I went home and did not respond to text messages promptly. The first indication that something unusual was happening came from the administrative assistant at the Forensic Sciences building entrance, a woman named Carol, who has worked the front desk for 11 years and who handles everything from faculty visitor check-ins to the occasional undergraduate who wanders in looking for the anthropology department proper and is surprised to find forensic sciences instead. Carol texted me in early March, which I saw 4 hours after she sent it because I do not respond to text messages promptly, to let me know that a woman had come to the building asking for me and had been told I was in the field that day, which was true, and had been given a card with the general office number. The text said the woman was older, had been with a man who was translating for her, and had seemed very determined. Carol's specific description was, she was very polite, but she was clearly not going to leave without information. I texted back that I would come in the next morning and asked if they had gotten a name. Carol said they had a name, but it was in Vietnamese, and she had written it down but was not confident in her transcription. She sent me a photo of the piece of paper. The name, imperfectly transcribed in Carol's handwriting but recognizable, was Nguyen Thi Lan. I sat in my truck in the field site parking area for about 10 minutes after I saw that. The field work could wait. I drove back to the university. I found Mr. Hoang waiting in the building lobby when I arrived. He was in his early 70s, a small, compact man with good posture and the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent their lives being accurate about things that matter. Translators and doctors and engineers, people whose work punishes imprecision. He introduced himself in English as the person who had been assisting Mrs. Lan in her efforts to find me. He told me she had returned to the bed and breakfast where she was staying because she had not been well that morning, a cold she had been carrying since she arrived, but that he was here to explain the situation and to ask if I would be willing to meet with her. I said, yes, of course. When is she available? He told me about the report first. He told me she had received it in December, that she had read it many times, that she had been struck specifically by the detailed descriptions of her son's physical characteristics, the healed fracture, the wear patterns, the evidence of a life she recognized. He said, she told me she felt that whoever wrote this report had known her son. I said I had not known him. He said, she understands that, but she felt, in reading the report, that he had been treated as a person by the person who wrote it. I said that was the intention. He nodded. He said, she would like to tell you that herself. She has been planning to do this since December. I said I would meet her the following afternoon. He asked for my direct contact information, and I gave it to him. He thanked me and left. I went to my office and sat in my chair, the one that has never been adjusted correctly in 6 years, and I put my hand on the heating pad in my drawer, and I sat there for a while. I told Marcus that afternoon. He was at his workstation working on a separate case, and I came in and sat on the stool at the 3-foot distance and said, "You know the case from January 2024. He said yes without looking up, because he knows my cases. I said, "The mother is here." He stopped what he was doing. He turned around on his stool and he looked at me and he said, "She came here." I said, "Apparently from Vietnam." There was a silence. Marcus has a way of being silent that feels like he is applying his full attention to a problem rather than simply waiting for it to become clear, which is a quality I associate with the best kind of medical training and the best kind of field experience, and not very often with forensic scientists who tend toward a different kind of precision. He said, "What do you need?" I said, "I do not know." He said, "I will be here." She came the next afternoon with Mr. Hoang. She was smaller than I had imagined from the name on the missing persons report, from the abstraction of her as a figure in the case file, a mother who had asked 4 times in 17 years. She was small and slight and wore a dark jacket over a printed blouse, and she moved slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints have been giving her some trouble for a while, something I recognize because I have the same quality of movement by 4 in the afternoon on a bad day. She had Erin's report in a manila folder inside a cloth bag she carried over her shoulder. She set the bag down carefully when she sat. Mr. Hoang sat beside her and slightly behind. She spoke in Vietnamese for a few sentences. Mr. Hoang translated, "She wants to thank you for giving her son his name back. She understands you did not know him. She wants you to know that she feels the report was written with care and that she was able to tell from reading it that the person who wrote it had spent time with him, that he had not been just a number." I said, "He was not just a number. He never was." She spoke again. Mr. Hoang said, "She says she has a question if you are willing to answer it." I said, "Yes." He translated her question. She wants to know if it was difficult to do this work, if it is always difficult. I thought about that for a moment. I said, "The work itself is not difficult. I have done it for a long time and I know how to do it well. What can be difficult is understanding that the work matters when you are in the middle of it, because you cannot see the end from where you are. You are looking at what is in front of you and you are trying to be precise, and the meaning of the precision is something you have to hold as an article of faith rather than something you can see." She was quiet while Mr. Hoang translated this. Then she spoke. He said, "She says that is the same as waiting, that she spent 17 years doing what she could do in front of her, and she had to hold the meaning as an article of faith." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Yes, I believe that is exactly right." She opened her bag and took out the manila folder. She held it in her lap. She did not open it. She spoke for a longer time, and Mr. Hoang translated in sections, catching up as she paused. She says she wants to show you something. She says, "On the 4th page of your report, you described a healed fracture to the right clavicle, consistent with an injury at approximately 12 to 14 years of age." She says when she read this, she had to stop reading and put the report down because she remembered the injury. "He fell from a tree when he was 13, she said. "They took him to a clinic and the doctor said it was a minor fracture. It would heal without casting if he kept still. He did not keep still. She watched him for a week with his arm in a sling, still trying to carry things, still trying to help. That was who he was." I looked at the folder in her hands. She was holding it the same way she had held it in the parking lot the next day, with both hands pressed against her. She had been holding it like that, I realized, since December. She spoke again. Mr. Hoang translated. She says she does not want you to feel that you must thank her for coming. She came because she needed you to know that the work was not invisible, that someone received it. She says, in her experience, the people who do the difficult work that others cannot look at often do not know that they are seen. I am 38 years old, and I have been a forensic anthropologist for 14 years, and I have kept the boundaries of my role correctly in every case I have ever worked. I have handed reports to case coordinators and gone back to my lab and not asked what happened after. I have not done this work for recognition or for gratitude. I have done it because the work needs doing and because I am the person who knows how to do it. I had never, in 14 years, had to work very hard to hold myself together in a professional conversation. I worked hard in that conversation. I said, "Thank you for coming this far." She nodded, and Mr. Huang said she understood. She said something else. He said, "She wants to know if she can see where the work is done. If she can see the laboratory." I said yes. I took her and Mr. Huang on a brief tour of the lab, the workstations, the documentation equipment, the storage. Marcus was there. I introduced them, and Marcus shook her hand with both of his hands and said something that he has never repeated to me exactly, something quiet and direct that I heard only partially. And she listened and nodded, and he nodded back. She stood in the middle of the main lab space and looked around for a long moment, and then she said something to Mr. Huang, and he translated. She says, "It is a good room to work in. It is quiet." The next morning was a Thursday, and it was the morning of my mother's 67th birthday dinner, which Diane had organized at a restaurant near my mother's house and which I had confirmed attendance for 2 weeks prior via a group text that I had responded to within a reasonable time frame, which for me is anything under 12 hours. Diane had texted that morning to confirm the time and to ask if I was coming straight from work or going home first. I had texted back that I was coming straight from work. She had texted, "Okay, I'll pick you up at the lab at 5:30 so we can all go together. Mom wants to see you." I had said, "Okay." I was in the lab at 4 o'clock when Marcus came to my office doorway and said, "The woman is here again." I looked up. He said, "Mrs. Lan. She is in the lobby with Mr. Huang." He said there was something she wanted to give you before she left to go home. I went to the lobby. She was there with the cloth bag, which she was holding differently today, not pressed against her chest but at her side, relaxed, like the weight inside it had changed. She spoke, and Mr. Huang translated, "She is leaving for the airport tonight. She wanted to come one more time. She has brought something." She opened the cloth bag and took out the manila folder, and she held it toward me, and then she seemed to decide something, and she held it against her chest again, briefly, and then she held it toward me again with both hands. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said something in Vietnamese, and Mr. Hoang was quiet for a second before he translated. He said, "She says, this is your report. She has her copy. But she brought this one because she thought you should have a copy too. So you know it arrived. So you know someone read it." I took the folder. It was a copy of the report I had submitted in November. 4 pages. She had carried it on a plane across an ocean and across several connecting flights and to this building 4 times. I said, "Thank you." I said it the way you say something when the sentence is not big enough for what you mean, but it is the best and most honest thing available. She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that comes from somewhere old and deep, the kind that people who have spent a long time with grief wear sometimes when grief has finally, after all of it, been answered. She spoke one more time. Mr. Huang translated. She says, "She hopes your family knows what you do. She says it would be a great loss if they did not." I did not say anything. I did not know in that moment what to say to that. We were still in the lobby, the 3 of us, when the door opened and Diane came in with my mother. They were 15 minutes early, which I later thought about because I am always the one who is early, and this was the first time I could remember Diane arriving before the stated time for anything. Diane had texted me at 5:15 to say she was already near the building and would just come up rather than wait in the lot. I had not seen the text. I had been in the lobby. Diane came through the door first. She saw me, and she started to say something about being early, and then she saw the lobby was not empty, that I was not alone, and she stopped. My mother came in behind her. We were arranged in a small cluster near the front desk, me holding the manila folder, Mrs. Lan with her cloth bag at her side. Mr. Huang beside her. I introduced them briefly. I said, "This is Mrs. Lan and Mr. Huang, who has been helping with translation. They came from Vietnam." Diane said, "From Vietnam," not with skepticism, just parsing the information. I said, "Mrs. Lan received the findings from a case I worked last year, the identification of her son." My mother said, "Oh," a soft syllable. She looked at Mrs. Lan and something in her face shifted in the way that something shifts in my mother's face when she understands something without being told it fully. My mother is not a scientist and has never been easy with the details of what I do. But she is a woman who has lost people and who knows what it looks like to have been looking for something for a long time and to have finally found it. Mrs. Lan looked at my family. She looked at Diane, who was standing with her arms slightly out at her sides in the posture of someone who does not know quite what to do with their body. She looked at my mother, who was looking at her with that soft, open expression. She looked at me. She said something to Mr. Hong. He looked at Diane and at my mother and then back at me and he translated, "She wants to know if these are your family." I said, "Yes." He translated. She nodded. She said something else. He said, "She is glad they are here. She has thought, since she read the report, about the person who wrote it. She has wondered about that person's life. She is glad to see that this person has family with her." Diane put one hand over her mouth. It was not a theatrical gesture. It was involuntary, the gesture of someone who has been caught by something they did not expect. My mother made a small sound. Mrs. Lan looked at me one more time. She bowed very slightly, the way you bow when you mean something by it, when you want the gesture to communicate what language cannot fully reach. I returned it. She and Mr. Huang said goodbye and they left through the front door, and the lobby was quiet for a moment. My mother was the first to speak. She said, "Erin." She said it the way she says my name when she does not have anything to follow it with but needs to say something, when the name itself is the thing she is trying to communicate. I said, "We should probably get going. You have a reservation." She said, "Yes." We walked to the parking lot together. Diane did not say anything in the parking lot. She did not say anything during the drive. I sat in the back seat behind my mother and I watched the city go by through the window, and I held the manila folder in my lap. The folder with the report. 4 pages, carried on a plane from Vietnam. At the restaurant, we sat at a corner table and ordered. My mother talked about wanting to try the soup. The server took our orders and brought water. The table was quiet in the specific way of a table where people are all thinking about the same thing and waiting for someone to begin. Diane began. She looked at her water glass and she said, without looking up, "How long was the case?" I said 9 months. She said, "From start to finish?" I said, "Yes, roughly." She said, "And you knew at the end that it was him specifically?" I said, "Yes." When the DNA confirmation came through and matched against the family reference sample, the identification was definitive. She was quiet. Then she said, "And then the report just goes to the coordination office and they notify the family?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And you don't hear about it after that?" "Not usually," I said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "So you spent 9 months on this and then you just went on to the next case?" I said, "That is generally how it works." "Yes," she said, "and she came here from Vietnam to tell you that it arrived." I said, "Yes." Diane finally looked up. She looked at me directly, which was not unusual, but felt different in that moment, felt like she was actually landing on something rather than looking around me or past me. She said, "What was his name?" I said, "Nguyen Minh Quan." She repeated it carefully, imperfectly, but carefully. She said, "How old was he?" I said, 23. She was quiet. She looked at the table. Then she said, "What do you learn about them when you work a case like that? What do you actually know by the end?" I told her. I told her about the bone density, about what it told me. I told her about the healed clavicular fracture and about the molar and about the musculoskeletal markers of habitual physical labor that began in adolescence. I told her about the way his body described a life of sustained physical work, of someone who had used themselves hard and completely from a young age. I told her about the blast trauma and about what I had concluded from the taphonomic evidence regarding the time frame of his death. I told her that he had not suffered long. She listened. She did not change the subject. She did not redirect. She listened the way you listen when you have finally decided that the thing you have been not listening to is something you owe your attention to. My mother, across the table, listened too. She held her water glass in both hands and she listened and she did not say anything, but she was present in a way that felt different from other dinners, from other tables. From 20 years of gentle redirection and soft deflection, and Erin works in forensics and something like archaeology, and she is very dedicated to her career. When I finished, Diane was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Gary's oldest asked me last month what you do." I said, "Actually, what do you do?" I said, "Forensic anthropology." She said, "I used to just say you worked in a science lab." I told him more than that this time. I said, "How did he take it?" She said, "He thought it was incredible. He asked if you could come to school for career day. We ate dinner. My mother had the soup and said it was very good." Gary texted Diane from the youth basketball practice and she showed my mother a photo of the youngest in a too big jersey doing something that might have been a layup. I drank coffee that was significantly better than what I get from the gas station, which I did not mention. My back hurt the way it always does. By 7 in the evening when I have been on my feet all day, the dull, low, insistent ache that I have stopped expecting to go away entirely and have simply begun to manage. I took ibuprofen in the restaurant bathroom and came back to the table, and my mother asked if I was all right, and I said yes, and she looked at me the way she looks at me when she is deciding to believe me, and I appreciated that she decided to believe me. We drove home the same way we had driven there, the three of us in Diane's car. But it was different, not dramatically, not in a way that you would have been able to see from outside the car, nothing cinematic or transformative in any visible sense. It was different the way that air is different after rain, some quality change that is not a thing itself but is the condition everything else exists in. Diane drove and my mother sat beside her and I was in the back. And the city went by and nobody needed to say anything. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like a rock in a river, water going around me. I felt like I was simply in the car. Marcus texted me the next morning. He said, "How did the dinner go?" I texted back within 2 minutes, which he told me later he took as a sign that something significant had occurred because my response time was unprecedented. I said, "Better than expected." He said, "Your family see Mrs. Lan?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And?" I said, "Diane asked about the case." He was quiet for a moment and then he texted, "Doc." I said, "I know." He said, "Good." I said, "Yes." The report sits on my desk now. The copy Mrs. Lan carried on the plane, the one she brought back to give to me, so I would know it had arrived. I had it laminated, which is not something I have ever done with any document in my professional life, and I keep it on the top of the cabinet beside my workstation, next to the photo of my father and me at the Natural History Museum, the one from when I was 7 years old, and he is pointing at the mounted skeleton in the main hall, and I am looking at it with the expression of a person who has found exactly where they belong. I look at the report in the moments before I begin a new case, the same way some people look at a compass before they set out into territory they have not mapped yet. I look at it because it is proof that the distance from the work to the person who needs it can be crossed. That precision and care over time, with no guarantee of acknowledgement and no expectation of it, can land, can arrive, can be received. What I understand now that I did not fully understand before, not in the bones of it, not the way you know something you have actually lived, rather than simply considered, is that the people who told me my work was strange were not wrong about it being strange. It is strange by any ordinary accounting. It is the work of sitting alone with what is left of a person and learning to read what they cannot say. It is the work of translation in a language that most people have no reason to learn. I was called strange for loving this work. I was called morbid and odd and quietly but consistently made to understand that my professional identity was something my family managed rather than celebrated. And I carried that the way you carry the things your people believe about you, with more weight than you usually admit. But what I know now is this: the work does not require explanation. It does not need to be made palatable or reframed or stripped of its difficulty so that other people can hold it comfortably. A woman crossed an ocean to deliver a copy of a report I wrote because in reading it, she understood that her son had been in the presence of someone who treated him as a person. That was the work. That is what 14 years of gas station coffee and a heating pad in a desk drawer and arriving 45 minutes early because there is no reason to be late to the work you love has amounted to. It reached her. She came to tell me, some work is too quiet to explain at a dinner table. That is the truth of it, and I have stopped trying to make it otherwise. What I learned is something simpler and larger than explanation. That the people who need the work know the work when they find it, and that their finding it is enough. I spent 17 years being told, in small, steady increments, that what I loved was too difficult for others to look at. What I know now is that across the world, a mother looked directly at everything I wrote and held it against her chest for months because it was the most important thing she had ever read. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be that useful. I gotta be it, without even knowing it was happening. That is what the work is for. That is what I am for. I am not asking anyone at a dinner table to understand it, but I am no longer pretending it is something less than it is. The year Quan was 13, he fell from a tree. He had a fractured clavicle that healed without casting because the doctor said it would. His mother watched him for a week with his arm in a sling, still trying to carry things. That is who he was. I know this because I learned to read the evidence he left behind, the inscription of his life in the material that outlasted everything else. And because someone who loved him remembered. This is what naming is. Not the act of assigning a label to a set of remains. Not the bureaucratic conclusion of an identification process. Naming is the act of saying, this person existed with specificity and care in the presence of whatever comes after. It is the work of refusing to let the unnamed stay lost. I do this because it matters. Because there is a mother in Vietnam who held a report for 4 months before she could afford the plane ticket, and when she arrived, she said, "Are you the one who gave my son his name back?" And I said, yes. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like exactly enough. There are people in this world who do the work that others cannot look at directly, who sit with the evidence of loss and translate what it says and hand the translation to someone who has been waiting. This work does not make the news. It does not make people comfortable at dinner. It is not the kind of work you explain with a short answer when someone asks what you do at a party. It is the kind of work that crosses oceans to find you when it has arrived. And if you are lucky, if you have done it with the care and the precision and the patience it requires, one day someone will look at you in a parking lot with both hands on a folder and shake with what it has cost them to carry the not knowing, and they will say, "You gave my son back to me." And you will say, "Yes, I believe that is me." And you will mean it without reservation, without apology, without the small practice deflection of years of Christmases and Thanksgivings and birthday dinners where the conversation moved on. Some work is invisible to the people nearest you and essential to the people who need it most. That is not a tragedy. That is the shape of work that matters. What I know now is that the work that cannot be explained at the table is often the work that crosses the ocean. You do not need the table to understand you. You need to understand yourself, and you need the patience to keep going until the work arrives. That is enough. That has always been enough. I just needed someone to cross the world to tell me